The committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. Ask that members may revise and extend their remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I, the chair announces that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote is ordered. And I recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this full committee markup. We have a robust lineup of bills before us for consideration, many of which represent bipartisan solutions to issues facing our constituents across the country. Before we get into debate, I want to take a few minutes to highlight the ever-increasing need for access to America's domestic mineral supplies. Three of our bills under consideration, H.R. 8446, H.R. 6395, and H.R. 8450, address the ever-growing need for reliable mineral supply chains. It's no secret that the global demand for minerals has soared with no end in sight. Our daily lives are so intertwined with mineral resources and the industries that produce them that whether one acknowledges it or not, society has officially crossed the Rubicon. Driven mainly by the need for energy technology, copper traded at record prices earlier this year. In fact, reaching net zero emissions by 2050 would require more copper than has been produced over the entire course of human history. That's just one of the materials that plays an essential role in our lives today. The question now becomes how the United States will step up to satiate the world appetite for minerals. Our adversaries, meanwhile, are more than happy to lend a hand. The U.S. currently relies on China for 16 critical minerals. China controls a whopping 75% of lithium-ion battery production and has significant stakes in many other aspects of mineral development and processing. In 2020, we all experienced how a pandemic destabilized economies and long-standing trade routes. Yet many U.S. officials continue whistling past the graveyard when it comes to expanding mining and processing right here in America. One of the first questions we must answer is which minerals are defined and labeled as critical. This question may seem granular, but it has far-reaching ripple effects. Critical minerals, those essential for our national and economic security, are addressed in H.R. 8446, which would effectively marry the Department of Energy's list of critical materials with the U.S. Geological Survey's critical mineral list, ensuring parity and better coordination across agencies as the federal government defines the scope of critical minerals. H.R. 6395 directs USGS to consult with the Department of Health and Human Services as it determines which minerals to place on the critical minerals list. In so doing, USGS will gain valuable insight regarding which minerals are essential to modern medicine and providing the best possible patient care. H.R. 8450 emphasizes the importance of potash, phosphate, and nitrogen in fertilizer production. Ubiquitous on just about every American farm today, phosphate and potash have no viable substitutes. The legislation directs agencies to reevaluate these minerals and determine whether they should be designated as critical. There's no way to overstate just how essential these and dozens of other minerals are to America's economy, way of life, and national security. The country is blessed with an abundance of many of the resources that we desperately need. Yet we seem content to let children in the Congo and Uyghur slaves in China mine our minerals instead of enabling homegrown industries to access them here in America. It's time the federal government gets out of our own way and unlocks American resources. I look forward to what I'm sure will be a lively discussion on these and other issues, and I yield back and recognize the ranking member for any opening statements she may have.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. Republican members of this committee have beaten the drum over and over that we should make it easier for massive global corporations to strip mine our pristine natural lands and drill in our wild, most special places, all supposedly in order to lower prices for struggling American families. We have heard time and time again that environmental protections are to blame for energy prices, even though the U.S. is currently the top producer of oil and the top producer and exporter of gas in the world. So of course, I am surprised to see that this committee has taken no action in response to the smoking gun evidence recently revealed by the FTC that big oil has been colluding with OPEC, the international oil cartel, to illegally fix gas prices and gouge the American people for profit. Pioneer, which holds significant leases on our U.S. public lands, has used taxpayer resources to drive up costs for consumers illegally. Almost 3 weeks ago, committee Democrats wrote to ask this committee to do something, to do anything about this fraud on the American people, and we are still waiting. Let's be clear. The core problem with big oil isn't in its lack of competition or its leaders' refusal to drill fast enough. It's that the U.S. has entrusted a handful of reactionary CEOs with stewarding and distributing the country's biggest and most important resources and exports. These resources are not just important for how much Americans pay at the pump, but for how much this planet will warm. And these are the same reactionary CEOs that are spending $1 billion in presidential campaign donations to President Trump to secure a 100-fold return in future tax breaks and deregulation for big oil. Too often, this committee's obligation is to big oil's bottom line, and we know it's exceedingly rare for that to dovetail with the interests of consumers, the economy, or the planet. It's polluters over people, pure and simple. Instead of discussing this massive scandal, we're here today considering industry giveaways to harm the black vulture and siphon resources away from critical mineral efforts. It's clear that corporate greed is never going to protect American wallets and American lands from big oil. Hopefully, before our next markup, we can finally come together to advance meaningful legislation on behalf of the American people to halt the growing climate crisis, hold big oil and global polluters accountable, and invest in clean energy for the economy of the future. And with that, I yield back.
Pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 1437, the Black Vulture Relief Act of 2023. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill would exempt livestock producers from liability under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, allowing them to take, which includes trapping, capturing, harming, injuring, or killing, black vultures that they subjectively, reasonably believe will cause injury or death to their livestock. Black vultures actually play a crucial role throughout America's ecosystems. These migratory birds are found across southern and North America. They act as scavengers, feeding on the remains of dead animals, cycling energy through ecosystems, and limiting the spread of diseases. Black vultures are also one of the nearly 1,100 bird species protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Congress has already tackled the issue of balancing the need to protect the black vulture species and shielding against their potential impact on livestock producers. In 2020, America's Conservation Enhancement Act, or ACE, the ACE Act, authorized a permit program for black vulture depredation. These permits are issued for $100, and they are used to protect commercial livestock by allowing the take of up to 10 black vultures through both lethal and non-lethal management tools. In 2021, Fish and Wildlife Service expanded on the success of its pilot program for this permitting to cover the full range of the black vulture and to make all states eligible for these permits. The program allows a state's Farm Bureau, Department of Agriculture, or other public entity to hold a statewide depredation permit, and then distribute these sub-permits to livestock producers and ranchers directly. This streamlines the permit process and centralizes reporting. So these permits are available to any livestock interest that needs one pretty much anywhere it might be needed, and it's been incredibly streamlined. This new program has been a success. It is currently fulfilling the requested need of livestock producers. In their testimony, the Fish and Wildlife Service indicated the number of permit requests for black vulture take is far less than what they are ready to permit, what they're authorized to permit. They believe that the current program can easily be expanded to support additional permits if they're needed in the future. You don't need a Fish and Wildlife Service expert to tell you any of this. In Tennessee alone, the statewide permit allowed for up to 1,000 takes of black vulture. In 2022, only 97 were used. And in 2023, only 64 of the potential 1,000 takes were used. Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter the full table of permits under this program into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. This legislation is just obviously a solution in search of a problem. And to make matters worse, the bill would remove safeguards that are built into the take permit program. It would limit the service's ability to recommend other mitigation methods that may be more effective. It would remove reporting accountability, and it would legislatively undermine the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the ACE Act. Instead of wasting our time on a bill that will never move, that no one needs, we should be working to reauthorize the ACE Act. In fact, the Senate version of that legislation would codify the Black Vulture Livestock Protection Program. We should build on the success of that legislation instead of tearing it down. And with that, I urge my colleagues to reject this legislation and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize myself and support Congressman Rose's bipartisan legislation, which provides much-needed relief to farmers and ranchers who are negatively impacted by black vultures. The bill makes necessary changes to the law to allow farmers and ranchers to take immediate action against black vultures causing harm to livestock. This approach starkly contrasts the current permitting structure, which creates an artificial ceiling on how many birds a permittee can take each year. The bill also requires farmers and ranchers to report to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every year the number of black vultures that are taken. Under current law, a permit holder can take up to 10 black vultures in 1 year. However, during a recent subcommittee hearing, Mr. Charlie Besher, a rancher from southeastern Missouri and chair of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association Committee on Property Rights and Environmental Management, testified that black vultures in his home state often descend in flocks of 40 to 50 birds at a time. Simple math tells you that a cap of 10 vultures per year does little to deter depredation at such a scale. Black vulture depredations on livestock are gruesome and very traumatizing for farmers and ranchers. They primarily attack and feed on calves when they're first born and their mothers cannot protect them. While black vultures were once an imperiled species, today they are thriving with a population of approximately 190 million worldwide. The growing black vulture population is hurting the operations of American farmers and ranchers. Cattle depredations by black vultures have been confirmed in at least 18 states, and their attacks on livestock increased by 25% from 2020 to 2022. While numbers vary by region, in some states, as much as 33% of livestock producers experience calf loss from black vultures. The bill provides needed relief to farmers and ranchers struggling with black vulture depredation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the bill?
I have remarks.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. H.R. 1437, the Black Vulture Relief Act, tries to act as a solution to a problem that, by all accounts, livestock producers are not facing. This bill would allow livestock producers to kill or injure, at will, black vultures so long as they believe that one of these birds might hurt their livestock. Black vultures are scavengers found across the southeastern United States. They can also be found across nearly all of Central and South America, and as such, they are protected under bilateral treaties under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This bill might lead some to assume that livestock producers have no recourse against black vultures. This is simply not the case. The Fish and Wildlife Service created the Black Vulture Livestock Protection Program, which centralizes permitting under state agencies to authorize allowed take of black vultures. This program makes it easier for producers to get permits to protect their livestock from these vultures through their state's Department of Agriculture or Farm Bureau. With the success of the current approach to black vulture permits, and considering the unintended consequences that this bill would create, I urge my colleagues to reject this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 1437. I recognize myself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Westerman 085 A&S. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I speak in support of my amendment in the nature of a substitute. The ANS aligns this legislation with its Senate companion by clarifying that poison cannot be used as a means to take a black vulture. In addition, the ANS clarifies that ranchers are not required to submit a report on how many black vultures they have taken until after the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service makes available the reporting form required by the legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment in nature of a substitute? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it's now in order to consider amendments to the ANS. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in the general debate, this bill is unnecessary. It's a waste of time. The America's Conservation Enhancement Act, or the ACE Act, already addresses black vulture depredation. And if we bring forward an ACE Act reauthorization in this committee, we would have an opportunity to codify a successful pilot project. If passed, this bill could actually have significant implications for the black vulture population and for migratory bird conservation. It conflicts with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and our country's treaty obligations, potentially undermining our efforts to conserve migratory birds. As with many animal species, I'm afraid that Team Extreme is trying to kill off black vultures, which have an important role to play in healthy ecosystems. They happen to be a pest to livestock producers in some instances, yes. That's why we have a program currently operating, currently working, that allows producers to protect against them. However, we need to consider the potential unintended consequences of this bill, which seeks to exempt livestock producers from the MBTA without providing any safeguards at all. This lack of clarity would make it difficult for the Fish and Wildlife Service to assess the impact on the black vulture population of this free pass to kill black vultures. As the service noted in its testimony, this could lead to negative effects on other sectors' permits, including aviation safety and property damage. Fish and Wildlife Service's current permit program for black vulture take is a shining example of success. It allows for the holistic monitoring of this population. It provides a comprehensive understanding of the issues relating to black vultures. And moreover, it grants livestock producers a lot of flexibility and authority to deal with birds that threaten their operations. The program also enables Fish and Wildlife Service to assist producers in identifying additional strategies to ensure that their efforts to deter and remove black vultures from their property are successful. The allowable take under this program far exceeds the amount requested or used in any given year. In Kentucky, the state with the most significant problems, the program allows for 1,500 black vulture takes a year, but only 100 to 200 takes are used. My amendment would require the Fish and Wildlife Service Director to certify that the need for permits is outpacing the allowable take under the MBTA and the ACE Act before this bill could take effect. At present, the permit program is functioning well, and livestock producers have an ample number of permits to address the issue of black vultures attacking their livestock. Given the current program's success and effectiveness and the incredible headroom that's available under the current program to meet any legitimate needs, we should codify it as part of the ACE Act reauthorization. This approach not only ensures the continued protection of our ecosystems, but also avoids exempting an entire sector from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, a move that could have far-reaching detrimental consequences. I urge support for this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself, and I do oppose the gentleman's amendment because the amendment would delay the bill's implementation by requiring the take of black vultures to exceed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act's allowable levels. What this bill does in its current form is allows more flexibility so that farmers and ranchers can take black vultures where the need is, but the amendment that the gentleman from California is offering would require the take to exceed the total level, and that's not what we're asking for, because producers do need relief now. The amendment would tie the hands of producers who need, again, flexibility when and where it makes sense. Ranchers need more tools to deal with black vulture predation. The most recent data shows that black vulture attacks on cattle and calves increased, again, 25% just from 2020 to 2022. These attacks are economically devastating to the ranching community, and to quote our witness, Charlie Besher, who testified on this bill, he said, "Each kill represents an immediate financial loss due to livestock death and ongoing financial loss due to stress, weight gain, and/or injuries to mother cows, and persistent disruption to operations due to livestock's hesitancy to graze, forage, in pastures that are habitually frequented by black vultures. More delays are not going to fix the black vulture problem. I oppose the amendment, and I yield back." Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this amendment. Fish and Wildlife Service records show that under their black vulture permit program, no state has reached even close to their maximum allowed take permits. And in fact, most only use 10% or less of their allowed takes of black vultures. This means that not only are we currently meeting livestock producers' needs for black vulture take, but also that states still have the added capacity to authorize more permits for take. This bill wouldn't be solving a problem, but would be creating unintended consequences such as undermining the MBTA and making it difficult to report take and monitor black vulture populations. The amendment before us ensures the continued success of the existing permit program by allowing this blanket waiver to kick in only if the need for permits exceeds the allowable take in the current program. I urge support for my colleague's amendment and yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
I'd like to seek a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Huffman number 1 will be postponed. Votes have been called on the House floor, so we're going to recess until after votes, and we will reconvene as quickly as possible after the last vote. The committee stands in recess. Committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum, and pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 8446 to amend the Energy Act of 2020 to include critical materials in the definition of critical mineral and for other purposes. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill?
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 8446. The Energy Act of 2020 took an important first step recognizing the importance of critical minerals and critical materials to the American economy and our strategic national security. While the respective lists developed by the U.S. Geological Survey and the Department of Energy have been very helpful in ensuring we have policies in place that increase and stabilize our access to these critical minerals and materials, they're not hitting the mark and require further direction from Congress. The two agencies use different criteria and do not take into consideration the same parameters, leading to sometimes very different lists. Notably, the USGS list does not take into account the forward-looking data and analysis such as international demand and growth trajectories that the DOE list does. Accordingly, the USGS list omits important minerals like copper, electrical steel, and silicon. DOE, however, doesn't make these same omissions since any mineral on the USGS list automatically makes it to the DOE's critical materials list. H.R. 8446 fixes this and amends the Energy Act of 2020 to automatically place DOE's deemed materials onto the USGS list. Under this legislation, each agency would still be responsible for reviewing elements under their unique purview based on their own technical experience. It would simply streamline interagency coordination and ensure USGS is taking into account the full picture and the best, most complete information when developing its critical minerals list. Before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this June 11th letter from the Copper Development Association in support of H.R. 8446 be entered into the markup record.
Without objection.
And I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I do oppose this legislation, and the story, the narrative, if you will, that we hear across the aisle for this bill is that it's just about consistency, that we have too many lists of critical minerals and materials, so we should just combine them. I don't buy it. This bill is the result of years of heavy lobbying to politically influence the critical minerals list. And while USGS's critical minerals list and DOE's critical materials list may sound similar, they may contain many of the same minerals, they actually were designed for very different purposes, and they should not be used interchangeably. The Energy Act of 2020 defines a critical mineral as a non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to the economic or national security of the United States and whose supply chain is vulnerable to disruption. Critical minerals also serve an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for the economy or national security. Now, the Energy Act of 2020 directed USGS to update the list of critical minerals to guide the investment of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. As directed by a separate provision of the Energy Act of 2020, the Department of Energy undertook its own assessment of critical materials specific to energy needs, Combining these lists may sound like a smart thing, but there is a lot at stake. The minerals designated on USGS's list drive billions in federal investment and permitting decisions. Now we begin to see why one particular industry might be lobbying so hard to get on that list. It is no surprise that an industry group would lobby to get all of their minerals on this list because it means money in their pocket. Copper is one we hear about a lot, so let's take a closer look at that. Copper is an incredibly important mineral, obviously. It's in everything from transmission lines to trucks and cars and consumer products, but even though it was designated as a critical mineral by the Department of Energy, it is not at risk of supply chain disruption for at least the next 10 years. That's because we're already a top 5 producer of copper in the world, and 33% of our domestic supply comes from recycled material. In fact, in response to congressional outreach on copper, USGS responded that, and I quote, "While copper is clearly an essential mineral commodity, its supply chain vulnerabilities are mitigated by domestic capacity, trade with reliable partners, and significant secondary or recycling capacity," end quote. USGS very well may independently decide that copper is critical on the next iteration of its list, which is expected in 2025, but we should let them do their work. Right now, copper is not eligible for the basic research and production support reserved for the most at-risk critical minerals, or for permitting support under FAST 41 for new mines, because independent scientists have not deemed it necessary. For the moment, copper is still eligible for significant federal support just for its use in the energy supply chain, as is appropriate for a material that DOE considers critical. All of that is to say, we don't need to be meddling right now. Doing so could end up taking resources away from minerals that actually are critical right now and that need more support than the well-established copper supply chain. I oppose this legislation and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize myself. H.R. 8446, introduced by Congressman Ciscomani, is a good governance, common sense piece of legislation. It helps to remove confusion, and it also leaves the autonomy with Department of Interior and Department of Energy to decide which minerals and which materials go on the list. It's confusing right now because the Department of Interior maintains a critical minerals list. The Department of Energy maintains a critical materials list. And in the Energy Act of 2020, there was a law passed that said that if you're a mineral on the critical minerals list maintained by DOI, you automatically go to DOE's critical materials list. What this bill, H.R. 8446, does is make that work the other direction, where if it's on the critical materials list maintained by DOI, it transfers over to the critical minerals list. And hopefully, it will remove the confusion of having two different lists out there. This is something that is supported by both federal agencies, and it's something that we should pass and put into law, again, for good governance and to remove confusion. And while each agency does use different metrics when constructing their respective list, merging the two would simplify the process of developing the critical minerals and materials list and encourage cross-agency cooperation. Under the Energy Act of 2020, every mineral on USGS's critical minerals list, as I said, is automatically placed on DOE's critical materials list. And again, this bill would enable this process to work the other way as well, harmonizing the agency's respective list. DOE's methodology for critical material determination is forward-looking. It accounts for international demand scenarios and growth trajectories, specifically for energy technologies. On the other hand, USGS's current criteria takes a much more retrospective approach, using historical data rather than forward-looking projections to determine supply risk to the U.S. economy and national security. This is an elegant solution, enabling each agency to still be responsible for reviewing minerals under their purviews and harmonizing their final list across agencies. The legislation will cut jurisdictional red tape to identify vital minerals susceptible to supply shocks, foster collaboration across sectors, and promote the well-being of our ever-changing supply chain. Again, I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 8446, and I yield back my time. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 8446. I recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for the purpose of offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Stauber 53 ANS. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8446, designated Starber 053. This ANS makes one simple technical change. It adds a short title to the bill, designating the bill as the, quote, Critical Mineral Consistency Act of 2024. I urge adoption of the amendment, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the ANS? There's no further discussion on the amendment. It's now in order to consider amendments to the ANS. I recognize the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansbury, for the purpose of offering her amendment designated Stansbury number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
All right, well, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am offering this amendment. It's a very straightforward, common sense, and it's in the hopes of deconflicting really the scientific process by which we designate critical minerals so that there's not political interference in the process. As we've discussed, the Energy Act of 2020 directed the USGS to develop a draft methodology and critical minerals list, both of which have received public comment and have been peer-reviewed through a scientific process. And it's through this extensive multi-agency and unbiased process that 50 minerals were identified as critical. These are minerals that are most at risk of supply disruption and essential to both the economy or national security, and therefore deserving of federal support and inclusion on this list. USGS's designation as critical informs everything from federal grants to tax credits to permitting decisions, recycling efforts, and other research and development. And the federal support resources are not limitless, so it's crucial that the designation process be insulated from political interference. That way, federal decision makers, including those of us here in Congress, can have accurate information to act on. But unfortunately, for as long as there has been a critical minerals list, there have been efforts to influence it. And we've seen these attempts to legislatively add minerals like copper, uranium, phosphate, potash, and other industry demands with no guarantees that adding these minerals would actually benefit the economy or national security, but most certainly would benefit the bottom line and pockets of these industries. And instead, what could happen is that federal support that is intended to actually support at-risk minerals, which are important for supply, which are important for national security, would be diverted to other minerals, which may be economically important, but not have that essential national security component. So my amendment is a very simple amendment. It would add that the Secretary shall not designate a new critical mineral unless the Director of the USGS certifies that the decision for that designation was made with scientific integrity and without political interference. Now, this is the process that USGS already does as part of their peer review process, but especially since this legislation is seeking to change the way in which we designate critical minerals, I believe this is a common sense amendment that all of my colleagues, I would hope, would be able to agree to, and that we would agree that we should not be politically interfering with what should be a scientific and national security interest. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do support this amendment. Congress created the critical minerals list to help us better understand which minerals are both critical to the economy and national security and at risk of a supply chain disruption. This tool helps decision makers prioritize government actions and investments. And so far, the list has been and should continue to be based solely on sound science and not political influence. It is amazing in this Congress that my colleagues across the aisle who are leading a Congress that can't govern its way out of a wet paper bag, the least productive Congress in American history, and yet they seem to believe that these same befuddled members of Congress know more than scientists and experts and wildlife biologists and everyone else. So we just see bill after bill after bill to completely end run any kind of deliberative process, any kind of scientific process, and just codify things that members of this body have no business meddling into. Members of this Republican majority should stick to doing what they're actually really good at, which is fighting like ferrets in a phone booth, and they should stay out of science. And so I support this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself, and I would encourage my colleagues to actually read the legislation. This does not list any mineral. It still gives the agencies, the DOE and USGS, the ability to determine which minerals go on the critical minerals list, which minerals go on the critical materials list. It simply coordinates the two lists. So I'm not sure whether political influence that's being referenced comes from in this legislation. I do know that this amendment, which would give the Secretary of Interior ultimately veto authority over critical minerals that have been listed by the Department of Energy by saying the USGS has to approve of those minerals, defeats the whole purpose of coordinating the two agencies. We want to let the scientists and the professionals at DOE and at DOI, at USGS, do their job. We're not trying to interfere with that, but we want to take these two lists and coordinate them together. And unfortunately, this amendment would undermine that whole process and leave us back at the same position that we are right now. And you would think that in the 2020 Act, where the critical minerals list was merged with the critical materials list, there was no objection in saying that the Secretary of DOE has to approve the work of USGS. So I think DOI should respect the same scientific authorities over at DOE and the process that they use to list critical minerals or critical materials. And again, this is a good governance bill, and the amendment would undermine that. So therefore, I'm not in support of the amendment.
Will the chairman yield?
I will yield you a little bit of time, yes.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to read the amendment because it's just a sentence. The amendment says, certification of scientific integrity. The secretary shall not designate a critical mineral under subsection A2A unless the director of the USGS certifies the decision for such designation was made with scientific integrity and without political interference. So what this amendment is trying to do is to ensure it is that the due diligence of the scientific and peer review process through the USGS was utilized in identifying the critical minerals. As I said in my opening, this is the process that USGS currently uses, but what we've seen, for example, in the last administration and previous administrations is that there has been efforts to undermine scientific integrity, even at the Department of the Interior and the scientific process. And the issue with DOE's critical materials list is that we're talking about national stockpiles, materials that are used in national security, but this is pertaining to the actual scientific integrity for the designation of critical minerals by USGS. So I just wanted to clarify what the amendment is and be clear about what it's trying to achieve.
All right, and I think I clearly understand what the amendment's trying to achieve, but I think it creates a double standard where DOI would have essentially veto authority over DOE and their critical materials list, and it doesn't work that way when DOI through USGS puts something on the critical minerals list. So I'm not questioning the scientific integrity of DOE or USGS. I'm just saying let the scientists do their work, let the agencies do their work, and let's marry the list together in both directions like we've married it together already with critical minerals going over to the critical materials list. So again, I believe this amendment would undermine that. I'm opposed to it, and I'll ask, is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, designated Stansberry number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
would like a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Stansbury number 1 will be postponed. We're going to take another recess till approximately 1:15. There is lunch for members in the committee offices, and the committee stands in recess.
that I can reclaim.
The committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. Pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 8450 to direct the Secretary of the Interior to evaluate certain minerals for designation as critical minerals. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purposes of debate on the bill? Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of H.R. 8450. Global supply shocks for minerals like phosphate and potash, which have been intensified in recent years by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have created uncertainty in the agricultural industry. These global supply shocks have increased the cost of fertilizer that are hitting farmers across the United States in the form of decreased crop yields and increased food prices. Ultimately, this is raising costs for American families and making it more expensive for them to put food on the table. While American families are already being crushed by inflation, they shouldn't have to face higher costs for food supply because the federal government isn't properly recognizing the criticality of these key components of fertilizers, and thus aren't taking the proper steps to ensure we have secure supply chains and proper access to these minerals. The Phosphate and Potash Protection Act of 2024 would help fix this. This legislation effectively directs the Secretary of the Interior to take another look at the criticality of phosphate and potash and evaluate whether or not they deserve to be placed on the critical minerals list. It does not force the Secretary's hand and automatically place these minerals on the list. It rather directs the Secretary of the Interior to work with the Secretary of Agriculture to reevaluate phosphate and potash and other materials important for the production of fertilizer. Once these minerals are reevaluated, this bill requires a report to Congress explaining the findings, and if the secretaries deem these materials meet the criticality requirements, the Secretary of the Interior is required to update the USGS critical minerals list accordingly. The critical minerals list is meant to help inform federal policy decisions and ultimately secure our global supplies of important minerals. As we face global supply shocks that are affecting our access to minerals like phosphate and potash, which are raising costs for American people, it's important that the critical minerals list reflects these concerns. And we can do that by requiring the additional review outlined in this bill. In closing, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I oppose this bill, I do want to acknowledge that it's an improvement from previous versions of the legislation, which tried to automatically add potash and phosphate to the critical minerals list. But it still consists of political interference in a process that should be purely scientific, not to mention that it's duplicative of the work that the USGS is already doing. When evaluating potash and phosphate for its 2022 list, USGS found that these minerals did not meet the threshold for inclusion. More than 75% of potash imports and 80% of phosphate come from reliable trading partners. The U.S. is the third largest producer of phosphate in the world. Currently, USGS is hard at work using updated data and methodologies to reevaluate minerals for their 2025 edition of the critical minerals list. They are also consulting with the Department of Agriculture, as already directed by the Energy Act of 2020. So there is important work on this that is already underway. Directing USGS to reevaluate phosphate and potash again would be a waste of resources and staff time that could be better used on new, necessary research to secure our critical minerals supply chain. Additionally, a critical minerals designation will not be a cure-all for the fertilizer business and for the prices of fertilizers. There's no guarantees that any benefit from federal support would flow to farmers and food. Even the recommendations for policies to increase domestic production, which again is already very high right now, that this bill would require, would not necessarily result in more production. That depends ultimately on the producers, and in recent years, production at potash mines has sometimes been purposely curtailed in order to keep prices high. While it's important to support our farmers and protect our domestic food security, this bill really does neither. It is an unnecessary bill, it's duplicative of ongoing agency efforts, and it sets a terrible precedent. For these reasons, I urge members to vote no, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? So I recognize myself. H.R. 8450, introduced by Ms. Cammack of Florida, would direct the Secretary of the Interior in consultation with the Secretary of Agriculture to reevaluate potash, phosphate, and materials necessary for fertilizer for designation as critical minerals on the USGS's critical minerals list. We often talk about the need for rigorous scientific review, and I'll never forget in my early career in Congress, I went out to California, to the Berkeley lab, the Lawrence Livermore lab there at Berkeley, and they did a kind of a trivia game with me. They said, "Congressman, what do you think is the limiting factor in feeding people in the world today?" And I guessed wrong. I said water. They said, "No, it's phosphorus." So we know that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the three main elements necessary for, or nutrients necessary to grow crops. And they said the world's facing a shortage of phosphorus. And they were actually working on very fascinating research to create or have organisms that would fix phosphorus in the soil so that plants could do uptake, much like certain organisms do with nitrogen. So I find it interesting that USGS doesn't see that phosphates are critical, since our leading scientists and researchers maybe on the planet say that it's the limiting factor to feeding people. It's the first thing we'll be short of. But for that reason alone, I think they may need to go back and reevaluate and talk to some of the researchers that have been looking into this quite a while. On top of that, the recent global supply shocks for fertilizer minerals have fostered uncertainty in the agriculture industry and contributed to rising fertilizer prices across the board. Between 2021 and 2023, the prices of some fertilizers increased 350%. And while farmers are the first to shoulder the burden of increased fertilizer prices, volatility in the fertilizer market can lead to decreased crop production, increased food prices, and greater overall food insecurity for the American public and the world. H.R. 8450 also requires the Department of the Interior to publish a report to Congress explaining whether the fertilizer minerals meet the criteria for the critical mineral list, and mandates USGS to update the critical minerals list if any fertilizer mineral meets the list criteria. I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 8450, and I yield back my time. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Hearing none. Oh, I'm sorry, Grace. Ms. Napolitano, you're recognized.
Thank you, sir. And I didn't listen to all the argument, but it would seem to me that water, you don't have growth. So it may stand to reason that it has to be who you ask. Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Lady yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 8450, and I recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for the purpose of offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Stauber 61 A&S. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and open to amendment at any point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8450, designated Stauber 061. This ANS makes one simple technical change. It adjusts the timeline that the Secretary of the Interior has to designate phosphate and potash as critical from 60 days to 45 days if, after consultation with the Secretary of the Agricultural, she finds that the minerals should in fact be designated as such. Phosphate and potash are incredibly important minerals, and it is important that the agencies judiciously complete the review of their listing status. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting to adopt this amendment, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the A&S? If there's no further discussion, it is now in order to consider amendments to the A&S. And I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So while this bill may not necessarily be harmful, it is legislation that is a good example of Congress attempting to fix a problem that does not exist. The Phosphate and Potash Act would require an evaluation that is duplicative of work that the USGS is already doing in their regular update of the critical minerals list. Proponents of this bill claim that these minerals that are used in fertilizer production are critical to maintaining America's food and national security, the supplies of food and national security. And while fertilizer production minerals were affected by the overall supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic, the price spikes that occurred do not justify adding them to the critical minerals list. Fertilizer prices are already trending downward, while production of these minerals have remained profitable. The solution to lower prices can't be to force the legislative designation of these minerals so that they're eligible for benefits that would affect production 10 years down the line. That's what the list we're talking about would do. We should instead be turning a critical eye toward the production and trade practices that are keeping fertilizer costs artificially high for the sake of profits. It's also no secret that the need for critical minerals is an issue that we must address as we progress towards our renewable energy goals. But as we grow increasingly reliant on them, it is crucial that we establish a responsible, efficient, environmentally sound, and just supply chain. My colleagues across the aisle like to boost the mining industry, often at the expense of proper protections and oversights, which have real consequence that harm public health, fish and wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation opportunities, and businesses. But the end-all, be-all solution to our increasing demand for critical minerals isn't new mining in every case. It can also be recycling. Addressing the supply chain as a whole would help us reduce the overall demand for critical minerals, which is the only sustainable way for the U.S. to continue transitioning toward a clean energy economy. Now, last week, I submitted to the record a 40-year-long study that investigates the impacts of organic and conventional farming practices. The Farming Systems Trial, FST, conducted by the Rodale Institute, has applied real-world practices to document the effect of 3 core farming systems. The results are very promising. They've indicated that organic farming systems match or produce a higher yield than conventional practices, which gets to the core discussion that sparked the introduction of this bill in the first place. There may be smart best practices that we can do in agriculture with all sorts of co-benefits that also reduces our need for these chemical inputs, these industrial chemical inputs, if we just farm according to these best practices. So now is the time to promote a well-rounded approach in how the U.S. evaluates where to invest resources during the energy transition that we're making. That's why my amendment would require the Department of Interior and Agriculture to evaluate how organic farming and regenerative agriculture can reduce our demand for minerals like phosphate and potash, and ultimately help create a stronger, more resilient supply chain. If we're going to require USGS to undergo a duplicative effort, we should at least make sure that they're looking broadly into how the U.S. can make use of all possible solutions to promote a healthy and sustainable supply chain. I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose the amendment. The goal of H.R. 8450 is to direct USGS to work with the Department of Agriculture to reevaluate fertilizer minerals, including potash and phosphate, for inclusion on the critical minerals list. Mr. Huffman's amendment would force the USGS to provide an assessment of organic farming practices and conduct an evaluation of how farming and regenerative agriculture can reduce the demand for fertilizer minerals. Further, the amendment would require USGS to make recommendation on ways to increase organic farming and regenerative agriculture. The amendment would force USGS to opine on agricultural practices that are well outside of its expertise, and that's why we've asked them to work with the Department of Agriculture that has that expertise. I oppose the amendment, urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back my time. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, designated Stauber 61 ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 8450 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No. Good job, Jeff.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to give notice of my intention to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views on the measure just considered. I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all measures considered in this markup. Under House Rule 11, Clause 2L, this notice extends to all members.
Without objection, so ordered. We will now proceed. All right, we will now proceed to votes. The unfinished business is a request for recorded vote on amendments to H.R. 1437. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. The question is on the amendment to the ANS to H.R. 1437 offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 1, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote.
First one's always a little sticky.
Takes it a minute to wake up, it seems like.
There it goes. I'm always working on that.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 12 and the nays are 17.
The amendment is not adopted. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair designated Westerman 85 ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 1437 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered reported. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 13.
The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with the recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is a request for recorded vote on amendments to H.R. 8446. Members will record their votes using the electronic voting system. The questions on the amendment to the A&S to H.R. 8446 offered by the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, designated Stansberry number 1, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 18.
The amendment is not reported. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, designated Stauber 53 A&S. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 8446 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 13.
The bill as amended is ordered reported to the House with the recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We now turn to the UC package. With the cooperation of Ranking Member Grijalva and the other members of the committee, it appears that we have worked out an agreement on 6 bills scheduled for markup today. As we have done before, rather than going through a formal markup process for each of the bills, I will make a single unanimous consent motion to report out the bills favorably with any amendments that have been filed and agreed to. Before we begin, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent motion? Mr. Curtis, you're recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman for including this bipartisan bill regarding the Colorado River in today's markup. Excessive salt in our rivers can damage sites in Utah's iconic national parks, limit the available drinking water in our rapidly growing state, and taint the water that ranchers use to feed the rest of the country. Several decades ago, Congress recognized the issue caused by ancient saline rock formations dissolving and discharging salt into the Colorado River. In 1974, Congress created the Salinity Control Program to address this issue. For nearly 50 years, the program has successfully reduced the amount of salt in the Colorado River. However, the Salinity Control Act needs several adjustments to address lower water flow and budgetary issues. Today, I'm pleased to see this legislation pass on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Chairman, thank you for helping preserve our iconic landscapes and creating more clean drinking water for Utahns. Additionally, thank you for including my bipartisan bill, the Recognizing the Importance of Critical Minerals in the Healthcare Act, in today's markup. I appreciate Congressman DeGette's leading this effort with me. The process for identifying critical minerals mandates that the U.S. Geological Survey collaborate with various government agencies. However, the Department of Health and Human Services has glaringly omitted this from the consultation despite the important role critical minerals play in our healthcare system. For example, MRIs require about 2,000 liters of helium to keep the magnets operational. Despite current helium shortages, this resource was removed from the critical minerals list. I'm not saying helium should or should not be a critical mineral. However, the primary healthcare agency should be at the table when those decisions are made. I appreciate the shared concern from my colleagues and your bipartisan support for my legislation today. I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the UC bills? I recognize myself, and I'm pleased to advance 6 bipartisan bills today by unanimous consent. First off, we have H.R. 5441, sponsored by Congressman LaLota, which reauthorizes the Long Island Sound Program. The program gives the Sound's communities and federal agencies a forum to collaborate on restoration efforts, providing financial assistance and establishing working groups to share best practices. Roughly 4 million people live along Long Island Sound, which generates more than $9 billion annually. Reauthorizing this program will allow its critical work to continue protecting a critical resource in the Northeast. I thank Representative LaLota for his work in reauthorizing this program, and I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. H.R. 6395, introduced by Mr. Curtis, the bill amends the Energy Act of 2020, requiring the Secretary of the Interior to include the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultations regarding designations of critical minerals, elements, substances, and materials. Many essential elements are used in the healthcare sector. For example, uranium derivatives enable over 40,000 medical imaging procedures every day that screen for cancer and heart disease. As Representative Curtis mentioned, liquid helium, which has no known alternative, is used as a coolant in MRI machines. Copper, gold, lithium, titanium, silver, and platinum are all critical components in various medical technologies, equipment, and treatments, including heart stents, pacemakers, surgical tools, antibiotics, and chemotherapy. Adding HHS as a consulting agency in the review process of critical minerals will ensure that healthcare providers have the tools necessary to provide patients with the best possible care. H.R. 7872, the Colorado River Salinity Control Fix Act, is also sponsored by Congressman Curtis. This legislation represents the agreement of the 7 Colorado River Basin states to adjust the percentages of reimbursable and non-reimbursable funds in the Lower Colorado River Basin Fund. The legislation will ensure that salinity control projects critical to supporting farmers and municipalities across the region can continue. Representative Moulton's bill, H.R. 1647, the Salem Maritime National Historic Park Redesignation and Boundary Study Act, would redesignate the Salem Maritime National Historic Site as a National Historical Park. The bill also requires the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a boundary study to evaluate the suitability and feasibility of including additional sites in this park unit. The Salem Maritime National Historic Site includes 12 historic structures, a downtown visitor center, and a replica of the Friendship of Salem, a famous sailing ship built in 1797. Given the multiple properties and buildings within this area, a redesignation more accurately reflects the full scope of the location. H.R. 3119, sponsored by Rep. Soto, would provide for the issuance of a manatee semi-postal stamp by the United States Postal Service. The revenue generated from its sale would be transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and used to protect manatees and their habitat. Finally, we have H.R. 7776, the Help Hoover Dam Act, which amends the Boulder Canyon Project Act to allow the Bureau of Reclamation to access and repurpose $45 million in stranded funds for the operation, maintenance, and replacement of the Hoover Dam. The funds have been collected from ratepayers for the past 20 years, but Reclamation cannot use them without congressional direction. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for all their work on this legislation. I urge the adoption of this unanimous consent package, and I yield back. I now ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Federal Lands be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1647, Salem Maritime National Historic Park Redesignation and Boundary Study Act, without objection. So ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 6395, recognizing the importance of critical minerals in the Healthcare Act of 2023. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 3119 to provide for the issuance of a manatee semi-postal stamp. H.R. 5441, Long Island Sound Restoration and Stewardship Reauthorization Act of 2023, H.R. 7776, Help Hoover Dam Act, and H.R. 7872, the Colorado River Salinity Control Fix Act. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following measures be approved and favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 1647, Salem Maritime National Historic Park Redesignation and Boundary Study Act. H.R. 6395, recognizing the importance of critical minerals in Healthcare Act of 2023. H.R. 3119, to provide for the issuance of a manatee semi-postal stamp. H.R. 5441, Long Island Sound Restoration and Stewardship Reauthorization Act of 2023. H.R. 7776, the Help Hoover Dam Act. And H.R. 7872, the Colorado River Salinity Control Fix Act. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motions to reconsider are laid on the table. Ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the documents the committee just adopted, subject to approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.